A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. We brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. G-Share's Wood Cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful with GSES. Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP
Dans ce contexte actuel de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la COVID-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. Technoserve Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous leur avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière Cashew, Technoserve, à travers Bénin Cashew, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de Technoserve pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné la TDA et Technoserve à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cashew que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou. Et ça a permis aux femmes des 2 Nords de participer. Je veux dire à Takora Donga, Boko, Albori, Zoukoli, le centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cashew. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous permet, elle nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues, pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons, et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager l'information avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière cajou au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de Technoserve via le projet Bénin Cajou.
Le projet Bénin Cashew a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Béné Cajou a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité, que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout faire la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces 2 organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Bassila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Atta Kakayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur et ensuite qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local chez nous pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Founded in 2006, the African Cashew Alliance (ACA) is an industry alliance for both African and international businesses interested in promoting a globally competitive African cashew industry. It is a member-based organization whose members represent all aspects of the cashew value chain, including producers, processors, traders, and international buyers. At the African Cashew Alliance, our vision is to have a sustainable African cashew industry that delivers globally competitive value-added products and secures profitability for all. On a bigger scale, our mission Founded in 2006, the African Cashew Alliance. For more.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export, and we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin, les 2 hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit
Benin Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more productive, competitive, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth engine for the people of Benin. It's being funded by the USDA and is being implemented by TechnoServe and our partners at CRS. Over 8 years, Benin Cashew will increase the yields and incomes of more than 49,000 smallholder farmers, triple Benin's domestic processing capacity, create more than 3,400 jobs, most of which will be held by women, and will position the entire sector for continued growth long after the project ends.
TechnoServe travaille avec des hommes et des femmes pour bâtir des fermes et des entreprises compétitives qui contribuent à la réduction de la pauvreté, à l'augmentation de la résilience des bénéficiaires et de leur communauté. Nous restons convaincus que la participation pleine et entière des femmes et des filles permet de maximiser la croissance économique inclusive pour un développement généralisé. Au sein de la production agricole et notamment dans la filière cajou, bien que présentes, les femmes sont confrontées à des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'accès aux facteurs de production, notamment la terre, les ressources financières, la technologie et les formations. Au début du projet Bénin Cajou, la participation des femmes était d'environ 20,57%. À fin décembre 2020, ce taux est passé à 34,67% au sein de la production et à 39% au sein du projet. L'objectif étant d'atteindre au moins 40% de participation des femmes. Pour atteindre ce résultat, nous avons mis en place un dispositif institutionnel avec tous les partenaires du projet pour intégrer le genre au sein de toutes les activités de ce projet. Nous avons un dispositif basé sur des points focaux genre qui ont reçu des formations sur différentes techniques, différentes thématiques. Nous avons mené aussi un plaidoyer pour la modification des tests statutaires des fêtières des producteurs de cajou afin d'alléger les conditions d'accès des femmes aux coopératives. Et nous avons pu avoir une femme présidente du conseil d'administration de la fêtière des producteurs d'anacarde et une femme présidente du conseil de surveillance de cette même organisation, ce qui est une première au Bénin au sein de la filière anacarde.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
J'ai constaté qu'avec cette formation, la femme a un grand rôle à jouer pour l'émancipation et la prospérité, bien partagée qu'à l'intérieur, qu'à l'extérieur, au sein du foyer. Grâce à cette même formation, la population, mais la communauté a un regard craintif en nous. Ils nous copient, ils voient la manière dont nous vivons avec mon épouse. Grâce à cette formation, nous avons pu réaliser beaucoup de choses.
Cette formation que nous avons eue sur le champ nous a réveillés par rapport à la femme, parce que dans le maillon production, on a constaté que les femmes n'ont pas assez à la tête, donc du coup,
there are still issues, there are contract defaults. Many people struggle to understand what's happening in the market. And when we look at what's happening on raw cashew nuts, we've got to wonder who ultimately is going to pay the price for this situation that we're in. It might be traders this year, but it could well be farmers starting from the new crops in East Africa in September. Hanging over all of this is the possibility of disruption. El Nino can have an impact on cashew production, as we've talked about previously, and we need to keep an eye on that. But let's start by having a look at prices. It's where we finished the last time and where we'll pick it up this time. So if we look at the long-term price average, and I've taken March 13 right through, or May 13 right through to Monday, in fact. And what we see is that the market is still at 14-year lows. That mismatch between raw cashew nut prices and kernels prices is still there. Interestingly, and this is often a signal of changes in the market, there is a wider than usual gap between the best, the top processors as they're known, and what I would call the desperate, those processors that are urgently trying to make sales to raise finance, to pay bills. And they are the ones really that have dragged the market down to these 14-year lows. So why is that gap there, for example? Well, if we consider smaller processors, they don't have the ability to make forward sales. They have poorer financial services, and buyers often perceive certain risks with those smaller suppliers, risks like contract default, risks like lower quality. We're also seeing that the premium that has developed for African cashew kernels based on quality, based on lower freight cost, and based on sustainability has come under a little bit of pressure in recent months. And that's continued since I was last with you. So these low prices that we've seen, I mean, they are being used. They're being used obviously by buyers when buying kernels. We see roasters, for example, hearing low prices and throwing around price ideas that you can't argue with because they're correct and they do make a reasonable calculation, but they are from suppliers that they would see. So in this chart, we're tracking the price of 320s over each year for the 5 years up to August 2023. And as you can see, there's a pattern of ups and downs over each year. So for example, the orange line is 2019, prices came down, they picked up a little bit again, and then dropped off towards the end of the year. Possible good news is that in 3 of the last 5 years, prices have picked up in August. Didn't happen in 2022. As you can see, prices dropped away. But the other side of the coin is that in 3 of the last 5 years, prices have then dropped away again in September. There's no real encouragement in the seasonality in the market. We used to say that at one time, the market would have the tendency to finish the year at a higher price than during the main harvest season, February through to May. But that doesn't seem to be apparent in the overall level of prices. And as I've said on this event many times before, we're probably already into the busiest time of year for cashew consumption. All prices have fallen. The biggest price falls have been in the Indian domestic market, which, as it turns out, is no harm because it does seem to have stimulated Indian demand and it does seem to have stimulated use of those carry-in stocks. More about that in a few minutes. And also in the specialist side, also in organic cashews from Africa, there's been a sharp fall in price. And this organic fall in price is probably slightly misleading in so much as it is really become apparent that a lot of the material that's in the market presented from Vietnam in particular, but also from other countries, as organic is not in fact properly or fully organic certified, that the supply chain is not fully tuned to the needs of organic certification. So this has impacted on prices. So this is not necessarily an impact of lower prices, of lower demand. Yes, demand for organic products was heavily impacted last year, but we're also getting the complication, as was expected, and I think as we spoke about last year, the possibility that any premium product can lead to corruption. And there's something of that going on in the organic segment at the moment. So be careful if you're buying organic, be careful that the product you're buying is fully and properly certified. If we look elsewhere, we look at the higher end, high quality, perhaps BRC certified African processors. And what we're seeing is that the drop in price over this period for them has been a little bit less. So we look across the market and we can see that the premium for African processors, as I've mentioned, based on sustainability, based on lower freight cost based on quality in many cases. That has been maintained, but it's clearly under pressure. And it's under pressure partially because inventories in African cashew processing factories, though they're not high and they're not surplus, they are probably a little bit higher than people would like them to be at this time of year. They might like to be 75, perhaps 80% sold at this time of year, and it may be a little bit less than that. Moving on to raw cashew nuts, well, we can see not an awful lot to say. Prices steady at the lower levels. We've seen prices fall away. Now, when you look at RCN prices, don't forget that the prices also reflect the quality of the product that's available. So naturally enough, you tend to get a fall away in prices towards the latter end of the season, in West Africa particularly, as the quality drops away. So you would expect to see a fall away in Ivorian RCN, for example. What's available now is not as good as what was available back in February, March, April time. It is quite an unusual season as well. We have a lot of changes, policy changes in Benin, changes in structure in Benin, in Guinea-Bissau, and certain changes in Côte d'Ivoire too, to a lesser extent. So not much buying of RCN. If traders who are experiencing defaults and delays from some of their customers, if they were to drop prices, that could stimulate further defaults, and you get this vicious circle developing then. So dropping prices, there's not much room to drop prices in honesty, but dropping prices could have a counterproductive effect for the people who actually want to make some sales at this point. But let's have a look then at how much raw cashew nuts are needed for the rest of the year and look at the situation in the two main processing countries. So first of all, looking at India. So we have here cumulative monthly imports for India. The orange bars are the 2023 imports. So this is cumulative. So it goes up as the year goes on because you're adding January to February to March to April to May to June, just to make that clear. And the lines are the trends in previous years. So the big one, the red line, 2022 all-time record imports into India, 1.38 million tons, I think it was. If we look at that, we see a very steep incline in imports in May, even steeper June into July. And the numbers then started to really take off as we got into September. Now, we only have Indian official figures up to the end of June. But looking at those at the end of June, imports into India were 12% lower than last year. Now, that isn't any surprise at all. The imports are 19% higher than 2021. So we have to consider that last year was the exception. Low availability of raw cashew nuts through the first half of the year caused Indian buyers to follow the market pretty aggressively last year and ended up with very high imports, as I've mentioned. India is the key market. It's the key market this year. It's the key market almost every year. It doesn't seem that the imports of last year will be matched or even got close to. Some people are saying that imports will exceed 1 million tons. This is what I think. So we're looking at the Indian raw cashew nut scenario, supply of cashews in other words, 21 to 23. And the bars are domestic use, export, all of these figures converted into raw cashew nuts, imports, the crop, opening stock, what would be a normal opening stock or normal closing stock, because I'm talking here about experienced, normal, what would be needed to get India through from imports in December, let's say, through to new crop in February. And then the actual closing position. So when we look at this, I've made two assumptions based on what we're hearing in the market. So what would happen if Indian demand grew by 5%, and that's the light gray, and what would happen if Indian demand grew by 10% this year, which would be quite possible, but seems kind of unlikely given the situation of a rather late kickoff in demand. Now, when we look at this, we can identify clearly what's been imported so far and then what's needed. Now, what's needed looks a little bit low compared to previous years. So what I did was I had a look at Indian imports by the end of June as a percentage of the final import figure. And what we see is in 2019, by the end of June, India had imported 41% of its final full year imports, 44%, 50% in 2021, only 43% last year. But right now, based on the increase of 5% in Indian demand this year, 5% over 2022, and that is a big assumption. But given the current level of imports, I think it's 527,000 tons imported by the end of June. It would suggest that India may already have imported about 65% of what it needs. So when we look at this, India's needs in terms of either the 5% or the 10% increase in demand, total will be about 750 to 820,000 tons. Now, why is that so much lower than last year? Well, if we go back a step, we can see last year's imports, the opening stock, much higher than any other year. And that's almost impossible to match with an increase in demand in 2023. Put it simply, Indian processors bought more than they needed by a long shot last year. Imports would have been up based on demand, but they opened the year with a very large stock of raw cashew nuts. Eventually that's turned into quite a large stock of cashew kernels, and they're working their way through that right now. So the question then is, will India be able to work its way through that inventory? Has the carry-in already been sold? Diwali is late and Indian demand is highly skewed towards the latter part of the year. So kicking off September, October, and then easing away again, usually in November. But Diwali is a little bit late this year, so that may kick in a little bit later. Question is, has the carry-in been sold? What will overall demand be? But it is very hard to see a situation where India would approach the 1 million or the 1.1 million tons of imports that's been mentioned. It definitely will not reach last year's import level. I mean, that would be sheer folly. They would end up with huge stocks in the warehouse. So looking at the Indian market, it looks like that purchasing of raw cashew nuts may be much further advanced this year than it was in any of the previous 4 years. Let's have a look at the Vietnamese situation. So similar factors, this is just 20% up so far, or a more conservative 5%. Vietnam obviously needs to buy more raw cashew nuts. 1.5 million tons never manages Vietnamese demand for raw cashew nuts. There are some transit stocks. Now, I haven't got those in place. So when we look at Vietnam, what we can calculate is that between the end of July and 31st December, maybe into January, somewhere between 720,000 and 860,000 tons of raw cashew nuts are needed. But that does not include any transit stock that's already in Vietnam, simply because we can't get good numbers on that right now. We can only get estimates. By next month. We'll have much better idea on that. That's somewhere between 110 and 130,000 tons per month. That's a little bit above average. It's about right. So if we look at Vietnamese purchases so far, assuming that we get continued good demand, either the current trend continues or it ends up about 5% up for the year, which would mean that demand in the second half, or at least export shipments in the second half, would be down a little bit on the first half. You can calculate that Vietnam has bought somewhere between 63 and 66% of the raw cashew nuts it will need And that means it's a little bit behind where it was in 2022 or in 2021, when Vietnam, by this time of year, by the 15th of July figures, had imported 71% or 74% of the raw cashew nuts it needed. So as we can see, there is something of a slowdown in Vietnamese imports, but exports still look quite positive. Also in here is the import of kernels, these unpeeled kernels, these Burma kernels. And as you can see, that figure, having knocked back a little bit last year, seems to be moving back up again in 2023. And that's often a sign of struggles in African countries, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, one or two others too. So looking at that situation then, let's try and transform this information on the kernels prices and the raw cashew nuts prices into a processing cost comparison. So as you may have seen before, what I do is I take the raw cashew nut price. So in this case, we're taking the average imported price of raw cashew nuts into Vietnam. So that means everything that's been imported this calendar year. The imported price of Indian RCN. So that's assuming that the domestic crop has been used or included already. And then for Cote d'Ivoire, the minimum price for that the CCA has put in place, and a processing cost of $450. For Vietnam, I'm using $200, which might, in some people's opinion, be a very full price for processing. But I think if we take finance and everything else into account, it's probably about right. For India, I use about $350 per ton, and that's per ton of raw cashew nuts. So if we look at this, we can see cost of the 320s, and this is adjusted for the grade factors. We can see the international markets, which is basically the FOB Vietnam, an average price between the lower end processors and the top processors. And the blue line is India's domestic price, which, as I mentioned, has come down a little bit in the course of the year. So if we look at the situation, we still see that in Vietnam, based on average imported RCN costs and today's market, that the market is very close to the cost of replacement of RCN, that it's very close to the market price for 320s, and that therefore margins, profits and losses would still be very tight based on buying a ton of raw cashew nuts today, converting it into 320s and selling it at today's market price. The situation for some processors will of course be different because they have forward sales at much higher prices. So if you look at the average export price of 320s from Vietnam in the first half of the year, you'll see the price is much higher because those are based on forward sales. The Indian situation, well, Indian processors, it looks like, a bit like last year, that there is an opportunity to make a margin on, particularly on the new prices, the latest prices for raw cashew nuts. But if someone was carrying high-priced inventory from last year, for example, that had been bought last year, if they were carrying that high-priced inventory, the profit margin calculation might be a lot tighter, given that kernels prices have dropped. And that's why the question as to whether Indian processors have used their stock from last year is a key question, because that affects the profitability of processing. And if it affects the profitability, it affects the volumes. And if it affects the volumes, it may well have an impact on pricing and on demand as the year goes on. And then to finalize, we look at the Ivorian position. It's representative of most African processors. The key factor is, does the processor have their costs under control? Is their marketing efficient enough to achieve fair market prices? Are they, for example, taking advantage of some of the premiums available for African raw cashews? If they are, if they've all of that in place, they should be doing quite well right now. And that's based on minimum pricing. So what you can say is that based on today's kernel market, based on minimum prices in Cote d'Ivoire, it is possible to make money. Now that's on a $450 per ton of raw cashew nut processing cost. But as we know, there are many processors whose numbers are much higher than that, up 600, even higher than that in some cases. So it looks a bit better than it looked a couple of months back. Even in the Vietnamese situation, which is still very tight, it looks a little bit better, though not ideal. How long can this continue? How long can it continue that we look at the largest processing country in the world, Vietnam, and we see many of the processors struggling to make a margin on their activity? Well, of course, it's very difficult to know how long that can continue, but there are certain factors that we should take into account. So we could say until all of the existing high-priced forward contracts are executed, are shipped and paid for. We could say until RCN prices come down further. We could talk about when the kernels market recovers, or when enough processors reduce their volume or close down to force prices either side, RCN margin and kernels, in a favorable direction for processors. And what matters here, of course, is not so much the absolute price of raw cashew nuts or the absolute price of kernels. What matters here from the processor's point of view is the relationship between the two. Can they buy raw cashew nuts at a level that allows them to make a profit? Can they do that over a longer period of time? And can they predict how their customers and their suppliers are going to behave in both of those markets? Difficult. So when we look at it, we think, okay, existing higher priced forward contracts, well, the clock is ticking on those. We've been in a low price environment. Prices started to fall this time last year. Anything after that, I'm calling lower price contracts. It's come down in the course of this year. We know where we are now. We just looked at it. So those contracts are heading toward an end, if not already exhausted. So you should see, and if you look at Vietnam's export prices from January through to June, the average export price has been gradually falling away. Quite slowly actually, but it's been gradually falling away. And we should be coming to toward the end, let's say, not quite the end, but toward the end of some of the forward contracts at the higher prices. Can RCN prices come down further? Seems unlikely. It seems unlikely that at this time of year that prices for good quality would come down further. Yes, for certain, there will be product traded at lower prices, but what will the quality of that product be? And that's the question. So always when we look at RCN prices, we must consider what quality is being traded there. Yeah, maybe it's $50 lower, but is it £43, £44, £48? This is a key question. And looking at it, although I think that East Africa, Tanzania to open, raw cashew nut prices might start much lower than in previous years, I think the overall fall in what's left in West Africa is unlikely for good quality material. When will the kernels market recover? Well, that's a huge question. That's a question we're going to talk about over the next 15 or 20 minutes. But when, right now, we're looking for light at the end of the tunnel and we're not seeing an awful lot. So although, as some people say, we may be at the bottom of the market or close to it, it doesn't mean that it'll bounce right off it. The recovery might be quite slow and it might need a few events. And frankly, there aren't many events likely in the second half of the year that can make that happen. Demand tends to return slowly. Where if you get a supply problem, which is not really likely till we see new crop early next year, when you get a supply problem, it tends to kick in very quickly, but demand tends to recover very slowly. And finally, the other possibility is that processors close, reducing their capacity. But this is often mentioned, but it only has an impact if demand also returns. So you've got to ask yourself, will anyone who's left processing at this stage after just about a year of low prices, difficult times through the COVID pandemic, are they now likely to close if demand returns? It seems unlikely. Take the case of India. Although this primarily refers to Vietnam, and we're asking the question, how long can this continue in Vietnam? If you take the case of India last year, factories that had been closed for long periods, that had been mothballed, so to speak, returned to business last year as demand picked up again. So I think it's unlikely that this will have a serious impact on the market. So when it comes down to it, this situation cannot continue too much longer, in my opinion. And a real turnaround is dependent on the combination of kernels market recovery, signaling recovery in prices without any spike in RCN prices. But I still think it'll take time. So we go back to our vicious circle that we talked about last time. If you were with us last time, we talked about this vicious circle to try and summarize the situation in the market. And what we talked about was the basic idea that the RCN supply chain is unsustainable, that not only in an environmental sense of unsustainable, but commercially and financially unsustainable, that it continually breaks down. It's breaking down now as people defer their deliveries of raw cashew nuts, as people sacrifice their deposits on contract in order to avoid having to pick up the product in the port. So an unsustainable supply chain, we have rising production, come back to that in a moment, lower buyer confidence, I'm talking about kernels buyers, post-pandemic, during the economic slowdown, and the impact of the war. Which, I don't know where you are, but where I am, every day we see more increasing reports from Ukraine, and that is certainly having an impact on consumer confidence. Which has led, of course, to weak processors offering lower prices to get finance, lower raw cashew nut prices. As the market falls, we get defaults in the raw cashew nut chain. That creates a circle within a circle, contract default, lower prices, more contract default. And that's a typical cashew pattern that's been there for quite some time. And we look at the lower buyer confidence, and that weakens processors who had become accustomed to being able to make prompt, spot, nearby sales to top up buyers at this time of year are finding that those buyers are not in the market. So that's what we talked about back when we were here with you last on the 5th of July. What's changed? Well, it looks like RCN prices have stabilized. Why is not clear. It could be simply because traders just don't want to put any more material into the system until they get their current issues resolved. It could be simply that there's not much trading going on, and therefore there's no room for prices to change. And it does also appear that processors seem to have stopped dropping prices. They seem to have stopped just aggressively offering prices into the vacuum that has been demand over the past 3 months or so, and maybe longer. So some things have changed. Is there light at the end of the tunnel? Maybe. So when we look at this then, in terms of an outlook, and we're still talking about the market and we're still talking about the short term. So I think there is room for raw cashew nut prices to slip lower. Now I use the word slip because I think that we might see it just slip down, drift down, as people say. This is not suggesting that there will be any major fall in raw cashew nut prices. It probably means that the carryout that's been anticipated in African countries could increase. Now, bear in mind that when raw cashew nuts are left in many African countries at the end of the season, they're often not well stored, and they may well come back as much lower quality material next year, or they may not come back at all. They may just be lost. Buyers, I think, will come forward. They will come forward for forward contracts, but I think that's going to be very, very cautiously. I think internally in many of the companies, they're looking at higher cost of money, reducing inventories, managing demand. Bear in mind that the situation that we currently have was largely caused by what turned out to be overbuying of kernels in the United States and to a certain extent in Europe, overbuying of raw cashew nuts in India last year. People don't like to be caught twice, and they will be cautious as they return to the market. Meantime, importers, looking where the market price is, as I said, at 14-year lows, they will be a little bit reluctant to make forward sales on kernels at these kind of prices. Anyone would, because they will fear that in the event of a turnaround in price, that there could be market defaults. If we get defaults, that's the nightmare for importers who tend to trade on pretty tight margins, and when they get defaulted contract, it's very difficult because they need to execute their commitments to their customers. Demand recovery, I think it's going to be quite slow. I think in Europe, it's going to be slower than we've seen in the past. Yeah, as I said, cashew kernel prices are low. Energy costs have moderated somewhat. Costs overall are still quite high. Inflation is quite high. I think interest rates are forecast by the experts to go back up further in the coming months in Europe. And I think that's likely to slow the recovery. On the other hand, we are seeing a few promotions come in line. We're seeing higher prices for cheap snacks like peanuts, potatoes, for potato chips are rising. We are seeing some innovation in products. We're seeing mixes, for example. We're seeing sustainability grow as a factor in the market. So all of these factors will, in the longer term, be encouraging for demand, but I think we might see quite a slow recovery in Europe, perhaps slower than in more price-sensitive markets. And not to say that Europe isn't price-sensitive, but it's not as price-sensitive as other markets. India, the United States, and markets in the Middle East may return to growth more quickly than Europe. And those are the four real key markets. You might add China to that. Imports to China have been reasonably positive this year. China looks like it's back on track as far as cashews are concerned. But if we look at these markets, we are seeing growth in India. There's the possibility for growth in the USA, but it's quite late in the year. It's quite late to introduce promotions now. If they happen, they're going to be relatively light promotions to begin with. And in the Middle Eastern markets, I think we've already seen the return to good growth in response to lower prices. So the outlook is mixed at best. As I said, is there light at the end of the tunnel? Maybe. So let's move on to our second subject for today, dealing with the new supply and demand scenario. So this week, we're going to talk about how we got into this position, how the market arrived, where it is today, which is a surplus. And the next time, in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about what could be done about it. And we're going to ask some contributors to help us find some answers to this difficult situation that we find ourselves in. But let's first of all look at the transition. So what we've seen is a transition in cashews from a tightly balanced supply-demand situation to a surplus. How did that come about? Well, if we first of all look at the production, so this is world cashew production 2009 to 2022 raw cashew nut tons. And you can see positive all the way with a spike toward the end of the period. If we look at the trend, pretty strong trend all the way through. Compare it to demand over the same period, or consumption rather than demand, let's call it. And what we're seeing that throughout the period, consumption and production were very closely tracking each other. We moved from a period of surplus towards the end of the noughties to a position of very tight supply demand based on growing demand, especially in India, Europe, to a certain extent in the United States, but also China and in Middle Eastern countries. Toward the end of the period, we got to a situation where production spiked up. Demand was impacted, especially during COVID, especially during 2020. And even with the strong improvement in demand in Western markets in 2021, this surplus emerged. It wasn't always like this. If we look back to 2016, and I'm picking 2016 because if you take 2016, add 3 to 5 years to plant a tree and get a crop, decisions made in 2016, 2017, 2018 impacted where we ended up. So if we take production and consumption trend back in 2016, so this time it's 2009 to 2016, and then we forecast it forward. So consumption is the orange line, production is the blue line. So back in 2015, 2016, all forecasts based on the trends that were there at that time, all forecasts were that this deficit would arise. I remember speaking at the World Cashew Conference in 2015 and presenting a forecast based on this. Now that's changed. But at that time, demand was growing quickly in India, in Europe, in China. There was steady demand growth elsewhere. Even North America was growing 2-3% per annum, and the Middle East and North African countries were also growing. Production was barely keeping up. Yes, it was growing, but it was barely keeping up. So when you got a disruption, or even the perception of a disruption in 2017, 2018, you got this enormous price spike. At that time, back in 2016, and this would have been the moment when people were making decisions about planting cashew trees, about improving their production, we would have seen 4 years of relative price stability. Big spike back 2011, 4 years of relative stability. So prices had moved up. Prices had actually been moving up since the mid-80s. Then they stabilized for years. Of course, stable prices, as we've often mentioned, meant new cashew products, changes in marketing. The consciousness of healthy food and snacking was in full flow. Fast growth in production. If you look at the European Union imports for that period, you'll see just how quickly a relatively developed market like that was moving up at the time. This caused an emphasis on production. The idea, whatever we produce will be consumed. And that would have been a reasonable conclusion at that time. For processors, the product, in terms of its marketing, well, it didn't need any marketing. In 2017-18, people paid up to $5.20 a pound. I remember someone saying to me, there will never be a problem with cashew pieces again, because there were new products, innovation, changes in the way cashews were being marketed. And then we got this probably unjustified, huge price spike. Processors in this period didn't bother with sales and marketing because they took the idea, this is a commodity. And as I always say in my marketing training, build and they will come. But they didn't, and they don't. It's a little bit more complex than that. There was little emphasis on marketing, little emphasis on markets and market organization, and almost no implementation. If we look at West African production over the period, rising sharply. And around about 2016, 2017, 2018, prices for raw cashew nuts in Cambodia were $2,000 a ton. production started to kick in, trees started to be planted. It had been going on for some time, but people were not expecting this. People did not see it. I remember even in 2019, only 2 years before Cambodia produced almost 1 million tons in a year, NGOs in the country telling me production would top out at 250,000 tons. This was not expected. Let's look at Cambodia, and we see this enormous trend in production increase, which has backed off a little bit now. Expansion based on the prices of that period. Expansion based on this demand trend. Basing the development of the sector essentially on a price bubble, even an unnecessary speculative price bubble. This price bubble, whilst people were planting more cashew trees, this price bubble was killing new product launches. It was undermining buyers' confidence. It caused processors, especially in Africa, to neglect marketing, and it encouraged governments to react rather than to be proactive. So when things are going well, there's no need to react. But this position encouraged reactive policy. Demand started to become more volatile, not only because of the higher prices, that was a factor, but following on from the price bubble, we got COVID demand crash in India and China, but a boom in the European Union and the USA, which to a certain extent hid the problem for a year. Then we see the unsustainable features of the chain, those things that we've mentioned so many times. The famous one, 30,000 kilometers to market for a kilo of cashew kernels, for example, in the extreme case. RCN prices were strong, kernels prices were weak. Final nail, war and inflation undermining demand, especially in Europe and in North America. So we came from a price boom, an unnecessary price boom, a speculative price bubble, into a situation of highly disruptive demand when production was also growing very rapidly or coming to market very rapidly. And one of the key factors, although we would have all recognized West African production trends due to the work of NGOs, development organizations, and governments proactive in the sector in West Africa, the Cambodian increase was only identified by a very few people until it actually started to impact the market. This brought different kinds of reactions from roasters and from supermarkets. So when we get to the crunch, when demand starts to fall away post-COVID, we get buyers reducing their inventories. We get them deferring their buying decisions. So they buy later. That means that the problem is with the processor. The problem is with the holder of the raw cashew nuts. And then we see, to add to these two problems, at least from the supplier's point of view, these are problems, we see higher retail prices. So as we know, and as we've discussed on this forum in the past, retail prices, especially in Western markets, increased last year. So whilst cashew kernel prices in the international market were falling rapidly, retail prices were going up. And of course, supermarkets that control most of those markets, they were looking at higher costs of labor, energy, packaging materials, money, just about everything. So they increased prices. Maybe they didn't look at cashews specifically, but this problem of higher retail prices has been a problem for the whole range of tree nuts: almonds, hazelnuts, walnuts, cashews, pistachio, you name it. So you get this increase in production, disruption to demand, changes in buying patterns. This is how we get to the surplus situation. Could it have been different? Possibly. Could it have been different because of better market information, better understanding? In my opinion, almost definitely. but it's also about the way we market it. So reactions from roasters and supermarkets, reaction from Vinacas. So we've seen Vinacas recently in India, talking to the Indian sector, mainly to the Indian government, and I suspect they're looking for access for Vietnamese cashews to the Indian market. If you don't know, the Indian market is effectively closed to the import of cashew kernels. Will Vietnamese cashew kernels be allowed into the Indian market? Seems highly unlikely. What would that do to the Indian processing industry? And there is this strange dynamic in this. This is a three-way conversation. Like here we have two countries, Vietnam and India, discussing the future of the cashew sector. Between them, the total production is less than the production of Côte d'Ivoire. When you think about that, you wonder about this conversation. This needs to be a different conversation, in my view. Seems unlikely that Vietnamese cashew kernels will flow into India. If they did, the Indian market would crash. Indian processing would collapse, some might say, but it certainly would be very negatively impacted. So that's one reaction. Other reactions have been to increase value added on cashew kernels exports. And this has been relatively successful for those that have been involved. So here's a chart for you. US imports of processed cashews. This information is quite hard to get hold of because the US imports a lot of processed nuts, about 140,000 tons a year. To get into the actual cashews, you've got to go into a much lower level of stats. But thanks to the International Trade Center trade map, we were able to do that. So when you look at the imports of processed cashews, this is under HS code 200819, in case you want to have a look for yourself. Imports into the United States of processed cashew kernels have increased dramatically, 31,000 tons in 2022. So you can see the main suppliers, Vietnam, Thailand, and India, but primarily Vietnam. And effectively what we see happening here is a major change in the structure of the market. We see the suppliers, and they're mainly multinationals, processors, importers, traders, but we see the suppliers actually competing with their customers. So in some cases, they're supplying processed cashews to their existing customers instead of the natural cashew kernels usually imported. In other cases, they're actually going directly for tenders and competing with the people that they're also supplying the raw cashew kernels to. This is a remarkable change. We've also seen exports from Vietnam to Europe. We've seen exports from Vietnam to Australia. So we are seeing more and more value-added processed cashews in international trade. And that is a reaction to the situation that we're in. It is a way of securing more value. It is, to a certain extent, a way of integrating the value chain. And maybe for African processors, there are lessons in there too. So we've looked at supermarkets. We've talked about retailers and their reaction to the crisis. We've talked about Vinacas. We've talked about this certain extent a switch to processed cashews. There were also some interesting ideas from India in a presentation by Bola Rahul Kamath at the Cashew India buyer-seller meet. This is a really interesting presentation. If you get a hold of it, it's well worth reading. I think it's available online. And he suggested things that I thought were really quite interesting: to revisit the grading system. I think that probably the grading system we're looking at is a little bit outdated. To promote production efficiency, well, that would be especially relevant in India, but it's also relevant in African countries. We've talked about that many times. And then we talk about promotion and generic promotion of cashews. This is common in tree nuts. It's common in US tree nuts. If we look at almonds and walnuts, the response to growing supply, the response 20 years ago to oversupply of walnuts was to market. And they fixed that. Walnuts, almonds, pistachios, good generic promotion. Question is always who pays for it? So having listened to this interesting presentation, I asked a few friends, mainly Indian processors, would they be prepared to pay or to contribute toward generic promotion? Almost everyone said no. So the idea of a promotional agency for cashew kernels, and I think for West Africa, I think there's probably something that could be done, should be done, either on a national or a pan-national level. And the idea of generic this continue of the trend. So in the 1970s, cashew processing
Recording in
moved to
progress.
India. In the 1990s, cashew processing moved to Vietnam. Will it move back in the 20s, in the 2020s, back toward Africa? We've seen that there are plenty of reasons to restrict or to reduce the level of processing in Vietnam, profitability, sustainability, but also the trend toward higher value addition on a more positive note. We've seen that Indian processors, very well protected by tariff and trade barriers, they want to make sure that their production is protected. I don't blame them for that. They're absolutely right. They need to protect their own industry, and their government is prepared to do that for them. But what's the long-term impact of that? The question really for me in this is that how can African processors use their advantages to be competitive? We're in a situation of surplus. So when we were in a situation of a deficit of supply, the argument was very clear. Grow them, process them, there's plenty of buyers. Now it's a little bit more competitive because there is an overall surplus. Prices tell us that. Yes, for sure, they're too low. But in this current situation, we're not going to see prices back at $4 a pound anytime in the foreseeable future. Maybe $3. And maybe $3 would work. And maybe stability of prices would be really what we're looking for. That's the reaction from processors. More questions than answers there. What about transition in Africa? What about policy? What about policy and transition? And what have we seen in response? What have we seen since the market moved to this current scenario? Actually, what we've seen is new objectives, new claims, many of them unrealistic in both senses, the claims and the objectives. 100% processing by next Tuesday week. These things are not going to happen. It has to be real. A strategy needs a plan. But we haven't seen a response yet in West Africa to this current situation. What we've seen is reactive policy. Effectively, what we've seen is more of the same. More price regulation, continuing to increase production. Now, more production of cashews may not be the ideal situation. Maybe better is more important than more right now. But to do that, we've got to judge the situation, not this week, next week, this year, next year. We're looking at 5 years from now. And that's what makes it so difficult. So far, policy in reaction to the current situation has not really been effective. If we look at consumers, and very quickly, I've shown you this kind of thing before, big questions now in the consumption section of the market. First of all, India, you cannot sell kernels to India now or in the foreseeable future. That means that growth in India, growth in consumption in India needs to be processed in India. What will the impact of that be on African processors? Is it possible that if there were to be fast growth in India, the kind of growth that we saw last year, is it likely that that would price African processors out of the market? It's possible. It seems unlikely given the high level of freight costs. But if you take growth in India, you're looking at 10% growth adds something like 140, 150,000 tons a year of need in terms of imports. So that production will be needed. When is the question? If we look in the Western markets, when will growth return? Now, what's going to stop growth returning? And by the way, I don't think it's absolutely for certain that markets in Europe and North America will return to the kind of growth levels that we saw between 2011 and 2016. Price volatility, sustainability or lack of sustainability are two key factors. So if, for example, prices jumped from today's price to $3 a pound very quickly, that wouldn't improve demand, that would damage demand. What we need to see is prices move up to levels that work for everyone and that can be sustained over a long period of time. So buyers in Europe and North America are looking at volatility of prices, sustainability factors more and more, and this is becoming part of the law too. Obviously, food safety has been and will always be on the agenda, and their own price competitiveness against other ingredients, against other nuts. These are really important factors, and we can add the situation in China. What will continue for cashews in China? Will we see further demand? Will China expand its sourcing of cashew kernels outside of Vietnam, which has about a 99% market share right now? And what about Africa? And maybe this is a really interesting question that is often asked but seldom answered. Is the reaction to this surplus actually for African processors on their own doorstep? What will cashew consumption in sub-Saharan Africa look like 5 years from now or 10 years from now? Because it'll be a long journey. And what's been done to promote the products, not just as an outlet when you're in trouble, not just as an add-on for perhaps for lower quality material, but as a fundamental part of the marketing plan for African cashew kernels. For sure, the main outlet for African cashew production is going to be export for some time to come. It'll be export of kernels and raw cashew nuts together, perhaps someday just of cashew kernels. But also there needs to be a question addressed about consumption on local level. Huge countries, large populations, improving incomes. Will they consume more cashew nuts? Finally, we look at the reaction in terms of marketing. Is the answer to this question of the changed balance of supply and demand, is it really about better organization and better marketing rather than any other aspect, rather than changing farm gate prices, controlling prices, asking India to change the way it does business? Maybe it's more about marketing. Maybe it's more about becoming customer oriented, about growing the products for markets, so that you grow a product with the market in mind, not just this idea of build and they will come, as I phrase it. Build supply chains, not just factories. Building factories has proved to be a pretty good idea. Building supply chains around those factories is much more important. Reducing price volatility, improving the sustainability. 3.5 million tons of raw cashew nuts moving halfway around the world every year is not sustainable. What can we do about it? and improving communications, improving the way we talk about cashew nuts, improving the way that we communicate cashew nuts. People ask me all the time, are cashew nuts really good for you? Is there damage to the workers in the factories? A lot of these issues can be easily answered. A lot of them have been already dealt with. But buyers and consumers are not always aware of that. In general, buyers are really, even those who buy cashew kernels, they're very, very unaware of how the system actually works. So improving the way we communicate, improving the market information could also be an important part of the answer to this new situation that we find ourselves in. Now, the good news, and I would always like to finish on some good news. The good news is that when we look at some of the research, and I was reading the Snacks magazine of the European Snacks Association, which is a pretty good magazine. It's available online. I think you register and they'll send it to you. Demand for edible nuts is forecast to grow in the coming years. The recent research suggests, now it's pretty optimistic in my opinion, but recent research suggests worldwide 6.3% per annum growth for cashew kernels. That would be faster than in the period 2011 to 2020. That would solve, within 5 years, that would solve the current situation, imbalance of supply and demand. Health benefits, the fact of unsaturated fats, the fiber and the minerals in nuts are important to consumers. That would tend to encourage us to believe that demand will return. It doesn't say when, but that demand will return pretty soon. And what they're forecasting, which I think is also very interesting, is that fast growth will be in Asia, especially in India, which in the case of cashews is very, very believable, and in China. So these two enormous markets could become the markets that rebalance, perhaps imbalance back in favor of consumption, the forward-looking situation for cashew nuts. But when we look at all these factors, we definitely need to start thinking about how to manage this current situation. And we're going to have a look at that next time in 2 weeks, all going well. And we're going to have a look and see how can some of the trends that we've been talking about be turned in favor of the cashew sector. And we're going to have a look at what do these trends mean for African stakeholders. So we might be having a look at some of the scenarios, some of the thoughts, some of the ideas to help manage this situation, and particularly looking at what are the advantages that the African cashew sector has that can allow it to grow and become stronger in this period of imbalanced supply and demand, low prices, and potentially the volatility that those low prices will lead to. Thanks. It's a pleasure to talk to you as always. I appreciate you joining us today. Join us again in 2 weeks for more on this discussion. And I will hand you back to Blessing. Let's see if there are any questions or comments. And if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat. Come online and talk to us. Or if you want to talk to them, talk to me another time about it. There's my contact details on the screen. Blessing, back to you.
Thank you very much, Jim. We do have some questions already in the chat box, and I would read them all out for you. So the first question says, how can African processors ensure their costs are under control?
Well, I mean, you know, getting your costs under control is about good management, good factory maintenance, making sure you have the right equipment in place, making sure you have the right people running your factory, continually analyzing what you're doing, having a good supply policy, buying the right material, making sure that you assess that material when you buy it, making sure your finances in line, making sure that you manage your business as a food ingredients processing, probably export business, and you don't approach the business, which we have seen in the past, that you avoid approaching the business as if it was simply an extension of a commodity trading business? It's a great question, and there's a long answer to it, but there's some ideas on it. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. The next question says, as prices have stabilized, could it positively impact demand?
Yeah, it would definitely impact demand. Stable prices, especially at these levels, is going to impact demand. The big question is when. When will we see demand start to turn around and pick up? And that is about confidence, and confidence is about a whole range of factors. Yes, low prices encourage people to do business and to cover forward. Low prices encourage consumers to buy more cashews, but they have to be seeing low prices at the retail level first, and they're not yet. We have to see confidence return to the market. No one likes to buy in a falling market. I used to find sometimes that actually you put your price up and you're more likely to sell than if you drop it further. So no one likes to buy in a falling market. Normally, in these circumstances, you might say that from high price to low price, the transition takes about 18 months to have an impact on demand. I think this is a little bit different. We're now 12 months in. I think we're starting to see in some markets the response to lower prices, in India, for example, in the United States. But in other markets, the important markets in Europe, for example, I think it'll take a little bit longer. So for sure, lower prices will impact demand. Question is when?
Thank you very much, Jim. So the next question says, how can policymakers be equipped to take good decisions?
Well, it's a really good question. I think that policymakers, to be equipped to make good decisions, they need, first of all, market information. They need to understand how the market works. To understand how the market works, they need to understand how to turn the information into knowledge and turn the knowledge into understanding. Having a price chart is helpful. Understanding what made the prices where they are is much more important. So I think that good policy needs good information. It needs a good understanding of the market. It needs a good market information system, therefore, but it also needs that the decision makers are continually looking at the situation and are proactive rather than just reacting to what's happened. Now, and we have seen some really good examples of this. We have seen in some West African countries where policies have been introduced and then revised based on the impact and the feedback from the stakeholders. We did a lot of work last year and toward the end of the previous year with the Pro Cashew project, and they have got some pretty good reports and some pretty good work on good policy making, and some of that is available online. So I think some of the presentations are available, well worth to get hold of those, but also well worth to encourage policymakers who are often very busy, often concerned with just the short-term impact of their policy, to get them to start to think about cashews in a different way, to get them to think about cashews as something for the long term. And I think that's really, really the key to it. For a long time, we've had very well-intentioned people who have either been getting poor information or have been receiving biased information from interested parties. And that has, on occasions, skewed their policy decisions. What we have now is a new situation, and I think that policy needs to adapt to that new situation. And I'm hopeful when I look at African Cashew Alliance, Pro Cashew, CICC, MOVE Project, and their discussions on policy, all of those organizations' impact on policymakers. I'm hopeful that we will see better policy making in the future. Blessing.
Thank you very much, James. So the next question says, the price of $4.02 for Cote d'Ivoire processing is based on $350 processing cost. But what is the RCN? But what RCN price is this based on? Sorry.
There's a misunderstanding there. Let's have a look at the slide again. So it's not 402, it's 204. I guess that's a typo. It's not 350, it's $450 per ton. And the RCN price is based on is the minimum price set by the regulatory body, the CCA, for 2023.
Thank you very much, Jim. So the next question is, what could be the reason for the decline in Cambodia's production?
Okay, so we've seen a couple of things happen in Cambodia. First of all, in the race to plant as many cashew trees as possible during the price boom, cashew trees were planted in many different places. Some of those places were not really suitable for cashew trees, but people had to figure that out. So as they learned that those areas were not suitable, for example, areas where that would be flooded during the flood season, those trees are probably been removed. Many trees have been removed as prices have been much lower, because planting other crops, perhaps fruit, for the Chinese market might have been more attractive. And therefore we have seen this, it's not really a decline, it's a kind of a correction, if you want to put it that way. Now, we also know that a lot of young trees that wouldn't have been producing have also been taken out for similar reasons. So I think that the reasons for the decline in Cambodian production are the weather, climate during that period. Secondly, a fundamental decline in the number of trees, and I think that will continue as we get a little bit of a rationalization in response to much lower prices. But I wouldn't be surprised if Cambodian production stabilizes around current levels and returns to a more steady growth level. Also in Cambodia, I think you're going to see the development of some processing and export of kernels. It is a big go-ahead country on cashews, and it's going through some growing pains at the moment. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the answer. Just before we bring it to an end, what should we look out for in the next 2 weeks before the next GNE?
Well, take a look at the market and see if you can see the signs of this change in the supply and demand balance over the next 2 weeks. Would be interesting if you're not already aware of that. I think that we're not going to see any huge changes in price. We're not going to see any huge changes in trade volumes. Certainly in the Western countries, it's August. It tends to be a pretty quiet month. Perhaps in the United States, towards the end of the month, you get more focus on cashews. If we are looking for specifics to look out for, I would look at how is the raw cashew nut situation in Vietnam developing? How is Indian demand developing? If we see Indian demand strong, that could be a good signal for the second half of the year. I would keep a close eye on if we do see European buyers come back to the market anytime soon, it will be a signal of a change, but I'd be surprised if that happens. It's likely to come relatively slowly. So I don't see a particularly volatile period over the next 2 weeks. It's always interesting, but we may not see too many dramatic changes in the weeks to come.
Thank you very much, Jim. I just realized that we have a question in the chat and not the Q&A feature. And if you don't mind, I'll just read it out.
Certainly.
And that's the last question. So the question goes, sometimes in Africa, processing is presented as a work opportunity and a source of income for women in particular. Today, we speak of factories of latest technology. In this, how can we create jobs and ensure exportable products?
Okay, I'm just having a read of the question myself. Yeah, I mean, it is difficult to develop an older factory into an efficient export operation. So I would consider looking at the opportunities in the domestic market, opportunities perhaps for packed products, roasted products in the domestic market. I would secondly consider looking at my supply chain and seeing if I could develop a certified supply chain, maybe organic cashews, maybe fair trade cashews, in a way that would then help to, I'm presuming we're talking about a smaller unit here, given that it's got the last generation of technology, but I think that the idea of looking at greater value addition and including in that certification of the supply chain as opposed to just food safety certification might be an interesting way forward to try and develop factories that are, let's say, not quite up to the state of the art at this point in time. Also, there may be opportunities to cooperate with other factories that are state of the art, and there are one or two of those around that would be prepared to cooperate with factories as, let's say, suppliers of kernels or partially processed kernels. So there are a number of models that can be adopted. I think this is a difficult time, but I think that in time it will get a lot better. And I think that still, I've no doubt that the future of cashew processing, particularly in West Africa, is solid, but it may need some time. This is a good opportunity, despite being in this dilemma. It's a good opportunity to plan now for the future. So I would, if you ever want to discuss that specific problem, give me a call, drop me an email, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. I think there's another question here, which I believe should be the last question. What can be the impact of Cambodian production on West Africa's production? And should West Africa producers strive to increase production following this impact?
Well, this is exactly what we're thinking of talking about next time. What can be done about this situation? Briefly, the impact overall is that there's more cashews in the world, about 700,000 tons more cashews in the world this year as a result of the increase in Cambodian production, number one. Number two, it comes to the Vietnamese market earlier. So it comes to the market February, March, when West African cashews can only arrive into the market in Vietnam after they've been harvested, assembled, shipped. So that means April, May at the earliest. So it may mean that buyers from Vietnam will arrive to the market later. It may mean that they may have lower price ideas in mind, because by the time they come to look at West Africa, they will already have covered a significant volume of what they need for the year. To my mind, it means that the development of processing in West Africa is all the more important than ever before, because you can work with your local processor immediately. You can work with them early in the season. You don't have to wait for export trade or export orders. I think that in the short term, I would be concentrating on improving the quality of production, improving the supply chain efficiency, improving the quality of the supply chain. I would be concentrating on, rather than planting more trees, I'd be looking at improving the yield of the existing trees. And I think that that's the best way to address the reduction in income due to lower prices. I think probably lower prices are here for a while. That doesn't mean we're going to be at the very bottom of the market for the time being. But I think now more than ever, it needs careful consideration about whether to increase production or not. And that often depends on how and where cashews impact the individual farmer, the individual farm family's economy. What do cashews do for them? Are they marginal and they add something, or are they a core part to their income? I think that's really important consideration. And how that is, and how important the cashews are for individuals, smallholder growers, really determines whether or not you look for more or you look for better. My guess is look for better, but that's a good question, and it's a subject we're going to return to next time in 2 weeks. So thank you very much indeed for the question. Back to you, Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. Just before we draw the curtains, do you have any closing remarks?
No, just to say thanks, everyone. It's good to talk cashews with you. You can see on the screen again my contacts. Feel free to contact me if you've got any ideas, any thoughts, any questions. I'm always happy to talk cashews. Take care. Hopefully see you again in 2 weeks. And think about this situation, and we'll have a great conversation next time around. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you very much, Jim. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of another session of the ACA Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Once again, thank you very much, Jim. And we also want to appreciate our partners and sponsors who have continually made it possible for us to bring this session. I'm talking about SNI, Intersnacks, CNFA Pro Cashew, GIZ Move, just to mention a few. And of course, to you, dear participants, for joining us. And to the team behind the scene also, thank you very much. As Jim mentioned, we'll be coming your way again next week. In the meantime, if you have questions, do write to Jim or write to ACA with all your questions. And please be informed that we are 39 days to the largest cashew event in Africa. That is the ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Event. This event will be held from the 18th to the 21st of September 2023 in Dakar, Senegal. At 39 days, we have still ongoing early bird rates, and we encourage you to go onto our website to register your participation. Until we see you again next week, do stay safe. Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.
Benin Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more